All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to afternoon session, our second day. So the first, in this session, we're going to have a keynote speech by Jacquelyn Schneider, joining us remotely. So Jacquelyn is the Hargrove Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Director of the Hoover Wargaming and Crisis Simulation Initiative, and an affiliate with Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. Her research focuses on the intersection of technology, national security, and political psychology, with a special interest in cybersecurity, autonomous technologies, war games, and Northeast Asia. She was previously an assistant professor at the Naval War College, as well as a senior policy advisor to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And today she's going to give a talk titled AI and Strategic Stability. To introduce briefly, this will look at questions around how artificial intelligence affects strategic stability, whether states go to war, and whether those wars go nuclear. Pundits and practitioners claim that the revolutionary impact of artificial intelligence for intelligence, targeting, allocation of weapons, and even lethality. But as AI changes military power, it also has implications for strategic stability. Early warning, nuclear stability, and incentives for first strike are all impacted by how AI is developed, tested, integrated, and applied to military power. What efforts are already being taken by the US military, and what can militaries do to ensure that embracing the AI revolution doesn't lead to strategic instability? And so with that, I will hand it over to Jacquelyn. Thank you again for joining us.
All right, thank you. I hope I'm probably giant on, my face is giant over there, which means I probably should have used slides, but I'm not going to use slides. My goal here is hopefully actually to open it up to a conversation and questions, and so not to talk too much. But I wanted to start this preamble, which with a very clear disclaimer, which is that I am a political scientist, right? I am not a technologist. I study people, processes, organizations, and how those inherently human variables interact with technology to impact what I think are some of the most important questions of our time, and probably a lot of what has been dealt with at the conference so far, which is, how do these emerging technologies affect why states go to war, how these wars are fought, and ultimately who wins those wars. So in general, I look at a whole bunch of technologies, and I've looked at characteristics of those technologies and how those characteristics affect theories about what makes the international system more or less stable. So speed, offense, defense, differentiation, proliferation, attribution, right? Lots of different political science concepts, but what I'd like to take from what I hope you take from this talk is that it's rarely that, one technology affects warfare in one way. Instead, it's a story of complicated contingencies when technology can pull states in different directions. So it's therefore human agency and these kinds of conversations that we're having between technologists and social scientists, which can lead to recommendations about how technology is developed, applied, and in some cases contained or regulated in order to make sure that it's more likely to be better for humankind than, decimate a whole civilization. So that's a rather long preamble to foreshadow a polemic I'd like to present here. And maybe this is a bit controversial in this crowd, which is that AI does not have to increase in stability, nor is its adoption for militaries or even within the nuclear enterprise a binary yes AI or no AI. It's therefore our job to explain and work with policymakers not to perpetuate kind of meaningless debates about kind of robot Armageddons, or on the other side, AI magic pixie wands, but instead for us to create concrete recommendations about the limitations of technologies, the externalities of technology, and to advocate for ways in which technologies can help us deter, avoid, or mitigate the worst effects of warfare. Okay, so the title of my talk is AI and Strategic Stability, and I'm going to focus mostly on the strategic stability side of that. And in particular, I want to focus on nuclear use. So the question I want to really delve into is, how does artificial intelligence affect incentives to use nuclear weapons? And what can states and individuals do to decrease that risk? But in order to start that conversation, we need to start with a kind of a discussion about strategic stability. And what is strategic stability? Here I'm going to talk about primarily escalation, and I'm going to talk about 3 types of escalation. And then I'm going to outline how AI might contribute to these 3 types of escalation and what therefore we can do, both as kind of recommendations for policy or the development of the technology to mitigate those risks of escalation. Okay, so 3 types of escalation. The first we're going to call deliberate escalation. So when we're talking about deliberate escalation in the context of nuclear weapons, what we're talking about is somebody using nuclear weapons for instrumental reasons. When a combatant deliberately increases the intensity or scope in order to gain advantage or avoid defeat. So think of this as using nuclear weapons because you feel like you're going to win because of it. So states might deliberately choose to use nuclear weapons for a series of reasons. I think the most prominent reason would be kind of preemptive incentives. So states are using nuclear weapons because they think it's going to coerce or compel other states to either de-escalate or to lead to a new negotiation or a bargaining strategy that benefits them. Like the most straightforward explanation for deliberate use is that states may use nuclear weapons because they believe they need to use nuclear weapons in order to win a conventional war in which they are asymmetrically disadvantaged. So this was actually the dominant US strategy for much of the Cold War, because estimates at that time for conventional warfare in Europe suggested that without US nuclear use, the Soviets would quickly overrun NATO forces. But in contemporary examples, you have situations like in Korea, where you have North Korea, which is asymmetrically disadvantaged against the United States and South Korea in terms of conventional forces. What does that mean with no jargon? That means there is no way the North Koreans can beat the United States and South Korea without using a nuclear weapon. When you're in a situation like that, where there is absolutely no way you can win without nuclear weapons, states have an inordinate desire to deliberately escalate early in a conflict and use nuclear weapons. This is a very dangerous situation. So this is a really good example of incentives for deliberate escalation. Deliberate use of nuclear weapons may also occur because a decision maker believes that use of nuclear weapon will coerce another state or change course on a previous foreign policy decision that therefore deters them from subsequent escalation. We could call this escalate to dominate. So imagine an actor who is interested in taking a territory, but doesn't want to send their military. They could use a nuclear weapon in order to convince other states to stand down. So this would be similar to the kind of logics of a state that chooses to invade another territory. So the key factor in deliberate escalation to nuclear use, as opposed to inadvertent escalation, which I'll discuss below, is that the use of nuclear weapons is a deliberate part of the state strategy. It's not an outcome that had to be resorted to because of unforeseen repercussions of an otherwise conventional strategy. They chose to use nuclear weapons because they believed it benefited them. So inadvertent escalation, in contrast, is the use of nuclear weapons that arises out of an otherwise normal conduct of conventional conflict, right? So you have a conventional war, and then two states want to keep it a conventional war, but they end up inadvertently escalating to nuclear use because of misperceptions or misunderstandings. In general, a sense of uncertainty that is created by the context or technologies. So, for political science scholars like Barry Posen or Caitlin Talmadge, inadvertent nuclear use is most likely to occur when states misperceive conventional attacks as either like a precursor for a nuclear counterforce attack. So I am building up my conventional war fighting or my force posture because I intend on attacking your nuclear forces early. Anytime there is kind of a stress on a state's nuclear arsenal, this can very much lead to inadvertent escalation. So if I am concerned that you are going to attack my nuclear forces and therefore cut off my ability to deter you or to conduct a retaliatory second strike, then that might lead a state to inadvertently escalate to nuclear use when they wouldn't otherwise want to escalate to nuclear use. This becomes even more complicated in a digital world where technologies are increasingly entangled and commingled between both nuclear and conventional. So a really good example of this is what's called nuclear command control and communications, NC3. Early on in the nuclear revolution, the command and control, the way we decided to use a nuclear weapon was generally completely separate from the way in which we commanded forces to, launch an airstrike or to build up defenses. These are completely separate. But there has now become kind of a commingling of how we submit those kind of orders or how we control our forces. And so it's increasingly difficult to disentangle what is nuclear from what would be conventional warfare. So when states are potentially attacking what they think is, a Viasat node that controls conventional forces on the ground, but they don't know that it is actually also helping control nuclear weapon systems, you could get yourself in a situation where it leads to inadvertent escalation. So the key thing to remember about inadvertent escalation is it's almost always tied to misperceptions within a war that's already occurring or a crisis that's already occurring. And those uncertainties can be created by the technology, by the weapons, by the way in which they structure the way those weapons receive orders, and the plans and the doctrines that states use to organize those different technologies and campaigns. And then the third pathway to nuclear instability involves accidents or unintentional uses of nuclear weapons. In my world, I think this work is kind of led by one of my colleagues here at Stanford, Scott Sagan. And he's looked at how the pre-delegation of nuclear command, so what does that mean? Allowing units to have standing authorities or orders to launch nuclear weapons absent of a presidential order, or going on alert. So is my nuclear weapon ready to be launched at a very, very short notice? Is it armed? Have we kind of bypassed all the normal safety and security procedures so that we can launch almost immediately? It's called and then organizational interests and safety considerations, how all of those things come together to make states more or less likely to accidentally use nuclear weapons. So the difference between accidental use and deliberate escalation or inadvertent escalation is that these other two involve intentional decisions to use nuclear weapons, even if it's because of a misperception. But accidents occur when states do not make a choice to use nuclear weapons, and yet it occurs. So maybe that's because of a misunderstood order, a failed safety mechanism, an early warning indicator that suggests that a nuclear weapon is inbound when it's not. So these pathways to accidental use can almost always be traced to organizational decisions that maximize risk, perhaps because there's an organizational culture that prefers offensive doctrine, or is incentivized to take risks because of increased tensions between nations, or that there's distrust between civilian and military. And so you insert these kind of other types of risk mitigation, which decrease safety, but increase some sort of control either between civilians or the military. So these are the kind of three pathways to nuclear use. So what does that mean for AI? So I want to start with deliberate escalation. So deliberate escalation is fundamentally a problem with overconfidence and misplaced certainty. How does artificial intelligence contribute to overconfidence and misplaced certainty? So the most dangerous scenario is when AI-enabled technology gives states the belief, whether it's right or wrong, probably wrong, that they can launch a nuclear attack preemptively and win a war. Now, that seems a little bit crazy. Oh my gosh, could someone actually rely on an AI-enabled technology to make that type of decision? Well, I've previously run a series of war games that looked at cyber attacks on nuclear command, control, and communications. We had about 580 players over 3 years. And the interesting finding that came out of that research was that it was the overconfidence in cyber capabilities and the misplaced certainty in a technology that players didn't completely understand that led to more aggressive moves in the game. So it actually is a common cognitive heuristic that some individuals can take, that when there's an emerging technology that they don't completely understand, that hasn't been completely fielded, and they don't understand the uncertainties of it, that sometimes they can look at that technology as kind of like a magic pixie wand. And they're looking for almost like a wishful thinking about using that technology to decrease their uncertainty in other domains. So when is this a problem? This becomes a real problem when confidence in that technology upends what was otherwise a somewhat stable interaction between states. Maybe there was so much asymmetry between the two states that the less capable state was deterred from launching any attack. Or maybe it's a situation in which states were otherwise pretty much symmetrical. We were able to deter each other. But a new technology comes into the fore that convinces a state that it has a moment where it is more capable than another state. And that becomes a dangerous recipe for preemptive strike and the preemptive use of nuclear weapons. I already kind of mentioned the North Korea situation is a really good example of an asymmetric kind of political scenario where a state might have perverse incentives to use nuclear weapons very early in a conflict. If North Korea was using artificial intelligence in order to derive targeting information about the United States or about South Korea, and it believed that that AI-derived targeting information would be able to shut down the United States or South Korea's ability to respond to a nuclear attack or to respond to a nuclear attack followed by a conventional attack, that might give North Korea that edge and that push to feel like they're in a situation now where they have a window in which the United States and South Korea are asymmetrically vulnerable, and therefore an opportunity to use nuclear weapons in a deliberate way. So what type of AI applications are very dangerous to deliberate escalation? Well, in general, it's AI applications that benefit the offense. So I just mentioned the use of AI-enabled technology in order to derive targeting information. That would be an example of something that benefits the offense. And in particular, when states are using AI-enabled technology in order to target counter-force nuclear capabilities. I know I'm using a bit of jargon, so I apologize, but counter-force is when you are attacking the adversary's nuclear capabilities so that they don't attack you first, which sounds great, but it actually leads to some instability. So if you're looking for mobile missile sites, submarines, aircraft that carry nuclear weapons, otherwise secret sites where the mating of nuclear weapons with their warhead occurs. If a state thinks it has asymmetric information about those locations, they might feel like they have an incentive to use nuclear weapons early in a conflict. And so I guess the other question is, are people really overconfident in AI? I mean, I mentioned a cyber game, but like, do people really have this sense that AI can do all things and give them, have such like confidence in the, like targeting algorithms, for example? And I think I mentioned earlier when I talked about some of these kind of ways that we get to escalation, how important organizational culture and organizational incentives are. The way individuals and organizations process uncertainty is really, really important to assessing the danger of overconfidence in AI. In my cyber games, we had individuals, they were outliers, but there were individuals that were quick to make assumptions or have wishful thinking about the capabilities of the technology. And in political psychology, the research suggests that these type of thinkers are kind of quick to cognitive closure, more likely to use cognitive shortcuts or heuristics to make decisions. Now, that doesn't mean they always make bad decisions or the wrong decisions, but it could mean that these type of leaders, if they're in charge and if they're relying on AI-enabled technology, would be more likely to revert to deliberate escalation because of overconfidence in artificial intelligence. So I'm going to move now to inadvertent escalation. And whereas deliberate escalation is fundamentally a problem with overconfidence and misplaced certainty, inadvertent escalation is a problem with how AI creates uncertainty. So inadvertent escalation is all about the misperceptions of intentions and capabilities that leads to inadvertent uses of nuclear weapons. So how might AI create misperceptions about intentions or capabilities? I think part of, in the political science literature, there's a lot of focus on the way in which technologies blur the lines between offense and defense. And if you look in the public kind of discussion of AI, and including kind of, I would say, kind of state-based rhetoric about AI and its impact on national security, there's a lot of discussion of arms races and offensive advantages and this perception that all the ingestion of data and the development of algorithms and building up an industrial base that's able to process that level of information, it doesn't necessarily create a net good or create advantages for defense, but instead that it creates advantages for offense. And this could lead to a misperception where states believe that a state that has better AI than them would therefore be more capable or more likely to go into the offensive, which could lead them to use nuclear weapons earlier in a conflict. I think the other example here of the way in which AI might create uncertainty that leads to inadvertent escalation is actually some of the research I've done with some of the folks that are in the room. I want to reference the study Escalation Risks from Language Models and Military and Diplomatic Decision-Making. That's with Juan Pablo Rivera, Gabriel Mukobi, Anka Rule, Max Lamperth, and Chandler Smith. And I'm like a very last person on that one. But that research suggested that LLMs have a general tendency over many iterations to escalate. And if you are using AI-enabled campaign planning that biases towards early nuclear use or towards counterforce campaigns, you could find yourself in a situation where you have this kind of misperception because of the assumptions that you have built into the campaign planning itself. And then finally, I want to talk about what I actually think is probably the most dangerous route between artificial intelligence and nuclear use, and that's accidents. So when artificial intelligence that is integrated in some way into either the nuclear planning, the nuclear targeting, the nuclear maintenance, or the nuclear decisions to launch doesn't work appropriately and causes nuclear use when it is otherwise not going to happen. So how could that happen? And actually, we have a lot of examples of kind of near misses here in the early digital age, right? Where you have examples of radar operators that think that there is an incoming nuclear missile and have to make a decision very quickly about whether they're going to respond to that with a second strike or whether they're going to let it go. But we can imagine in a scenario in which states are actually, we don't have to imagine. This is today, a scenario in which states are more and more reliant on large amounts of data and the integration of a wide variety of sensors that all require some level of machine learning or algorithms in order to parse, that there could be a situation in which that doesn't work appropriately, where something is identified as an incoming nuclear attack that is not actually a nuclear attack, or where something is identified as an appropriate target, which is not an appropriate target, right? And so the farther that states and militaries go to integrating that automation and the use of AI into either their targeting for nuclear weapons or the decisions to launch, the more likely that these accidents might occur. So the more humans in the loop, the less chance that AI accidents lead to nuclear war. And so I think I could stop there and say, well, this seems logical. And so let's do that. But it's not that easy. There are so many incentives to use artificial intelligence in a way that may lead states to intentionally or unintentionally put AI in the loop. So for example, when there are vulnerabilities to nuclear command, control, and communications. In other words, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to control my nuclear weapons in the face of an impending nuclear attack. That might give states the incentive to automate or delegate to artificial intelligence the decision to launch. And I know that sounds crazy, but actually the Soviets had a very unsophisticated example of this, what we call a dead hand, that was meant to kind of safeguard their ability to use their nuclear weapons in a second strike, even if some of their nuclear command and control were threatened. And in my games, so I have this cyber game where I introduce vulnerabilities to nuclear command, control, and communication. I found that there were actually really strong incentives to automate and move to lower levels of pre-delegation and to use artificial intelligence as a solution to cyber vulnerabilities for nuclear command and control. And then if anyone's seen Dr. Strangelove, maybe not in this room, I don't know, this idea that, states can use dead hand and like saying, hey, look, if you take my systems out, I'm just going to rely on this AI dead hand as a means of deterrence. And that you could see incentives for states to do that, especially in asymmetric situations where they are really, really concerned about the viability of their nuclear arsenal. So North Korea, once again, is a very dangerous situation. But I think even China has articulated concerns about the survival of their nuclear arsenal. Okay. So the three pathways to escalation: deliberate, inadvertent, and accidental. So what does that mean for policy? What does that mean about where we are today? And I want to start first with kind of what that means in terms of the US and its policies about AI and nuclear use. And I want to highlight some good news. So just recently, Xi Jinping and Biden agreed that human beings and not artificial intelligence should make decisions over the use of nuclear weapons. That is not a treaty. That is not an agreement, but that is a very top-down public recognition of the dangers of the integration of AI. It does not, however, represent how complicated and entangled AI is within the entire nuclear enterprise. And I think that statement coming from these heads of state will probably, hopefully, trickle down to track one negotiations between the countries that speaks more specifically about the safest ways to integrate and control for the dangers of artificial intelligence in nuclear launches. I think the DoD policy on the ethical use of artificial intelligence represents real leadership by the United States about thinking about not only how do you integrate artificial intelligence in a safe way and an ethical way, but also what are the responsibilities in the development and testing of artificial intelligence. Does that mean that the US is going to get it right every time? Absolutely not. And actually, you should always track and see whether policy recommendations end up being implemented in technologies that are adopted on the battlefield. It's like very complicated to go from policy to a thing on the battlefield. It just is. So it's not saying like the DoD, the US DoD has got it right and we can walk away. But instead that I think that there are people at the very top of United States decision making that recognize that while artificial intelligence is really important to building an effective deterrent, it also has these real dangers for accidents. And so what can we do in order to make sure that we're developing it as ethically as possible? I will say that in generalities, AI applications that benefit defense and early warning are going to be less problematic than AI technologies that are geared towards rapid decision making and offense. Deliberate escalation is mostly about an idea that you have a preemptive offensive advantage. If AI can deter or at least degrade the confidence in that advantage, then you can see potentially kind of a stability, more of a stability in the mix. I think in general, and this is something that that Max and I have worked on, and our piece in Foreign Affairs was written with the idea of doing this, is that the solution to overconfidence and the dangers of deliberate escalation is giving users an understanding of the limitations of AI, decreasing their confidence in the technology. So teaching policymakers who are like me, they are like not smart technologists like many of you sitting in the room. They're just like people who read words and like have to make big decisions with technologies that they can probably barely operate. So teaching them about things like hallucinations, false positives, biases, and even actually the danger of how the data sets and the algorithms can be manipulated by adversaries will decrease the problem of overconfidence and misplaced certainty. And I think in general, getting under the hood of artificial intelligence and giving users a level of knowledge that they need to know to be able to interrogate anything they're working with that involves AI-enabled technology is really, really important and actually very difficult. I think when we talk about regulations or agreed frameworks or arms control, which actually I'm very pessimistic about arms control, but sure, arms control, really that needs to be focused on the development, testing, and adoption of these technologies, not on the user. I think it will be very, very difficult to control accidents and inverted escalation if you are giving the users fundamentally flawed technology. So most of what we can do to create safety regimes is going to be in the early stages of that development and development of the technology. And then it's on organizational incentives, safety, and training to decrease the danger when it comes to the actual user. And then I want to end this with saying that a lot of these recommendations are about the US, and a lot of my conversations are about the US. And maybe this is contentious, you guys are in Canada, but actually the US is way more responsible here than most of the problem actors. The danger is that there are states that have real incentives to use nuclear weapons because they're less certain of their conventional or nuclear capability. I've talked about North Korea a lot. I think to some extent China and perhaps even Russia are not incentivized to take the same safety measures that we have discussed in this conversation. And that's why, because they do have incentives for deliberate escalation, I think that's why it's so important to convince these countries the dangers to themselves of inadvertent or accidental escalation so that they can make choices during the development of the technology and about the adoption of the technology that may limit the some of the accidental potential uses of AI. I'm not very confident that if you wait to try and solve the instability problem with the user, especially with these countries, that you'll be able to have any success. Okay, I talked longer than I expected. I'm sorry, but I'd love to open it up to conversation.
Right. If you have a question, please come up to the mic. So let's go right ahead.
Greetings, thank you. I'm Aaron Lutman from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. The way that you framed this seems to be from an implicit standpoint of AI as being a subordinate technology to sort of core pillars, whether conventional forces or nuclear. Now, if a nuclear power were to take a doctrine of having AI as a pure technology in the way they think about warfighting to nuclear, how would that impact strategic deterrence, where you're no longer just thinking about AI as how does it kind of modify or augment our current nuclear deterrence theory, but how does the whole battlefield change when you think of AI as a full pure technology?
So are you saying, like, how does AI affect everything we do on the battlefield? Or are you saying...
What I'm asking you is, how does it change your theory of deterrence? If it's no longer, if you're no longer just thinking about how do my nukes respond to somebody else's nukes, but now how do my AI capabilities, like how might they trigger a nuke response, or how do I integrate AI sort of across all the domains as a peer? So there are countries, there are nuclear powers that have full, military branches designed around data, AI, and cyber. And if you have a full military branch, now that's fully peer to your other warfighting capabilities. So your deterrence theory is different because you don't think of AI as just another widget that goes on to your conventional or nuclear capabilities, but you think of it as a holistic thing on its own.
Yeah, and maybe we do have like fundamentally different ideas about the way in which maybe your question gets to the root of, like, you and I probably might have differences in opinion about how we do think AI will impact the battlefield in war. I don't think AI has a standalone capability without being attached to these other means of conflict. And so it is the way in which they've attached themselves, and not the fact that AI just exists, that is more important to looking at how AI affects kind of general conventional balances of power.
Okay,
but
isn't it an issue that, like, whether or not it has that capability, if a nuclear power has a doctrine of that, doesn't that change the deterrence theory? Whether or not the AI has an actual technical capability is sort of apart from how you see the deterrence.
Whether the nuclear armed state has a AI in its nuclear doctrine?
All right, maybe we should.
I'm sorry.
We'll take a next question.
With the question.
Right. Yeah. So moving on, we'll take a question from online here. Okay, this one is working. We'll take a question from online. The question is, there is a block nuclear launch by Autonomous Artificial Intelligence Act. This is in the U.S. government. I believe it's in the Senate. Do you think there should be a block AI-informed nuclear launch act as well, sort of extending from direct control over nuclear weapons to, sort of AI-assisted, nuclear use authorization?
I think that would be impossible, because I think there's some level of, whether it's artificial intelligence or machine learning, there's some level of automated processing of data that already occurs within the nuclear enterprise. Early warning, for example, it used to be you would get early warning from 4 or 5 sensors. Right now, this is a much more complicated picture with lots of different sensors from lots of different types of intelligence. And so you're looking, there is some level of, if it's not, AI, it is some level of computer-based automation that is processing that information and then presenting it to decision makers as kind of early warning or situational awareness. So I think it would be extremely difficult in, imagine a discussion between two countries which are trying to kind of find what is that line at which there is no AI assistance. I think that would be very, very difficult. And so I don't think it's feasible to be able to completely separate. There will be some level of AI assistance within the nuclear enterprise. I think where President Biden and Xi Jinping seem to be coming down on is let's make that line be human control of the actual decision to launch. So it is likely that decision to launch will be enabled in some ways by some level of artificial intelligence intermediary that has processed some of that information. And I don't think it's possible to completely ban that.
All right, cool. Thank you. Next question in person.
Thank you. My name is Alexandra. And first of all, I wanted to really thank you for a very insightful talk. I learned a lot. I'm coming from the computer science background, and especially the first part of the presentation was super insightful for me. And I actually have a question not related to artificial intelligence, but to this classification of the escalation risks. And I'm curious specifically in the context of Russian invasion in Ukraine. I'm coming from the region myself, and I've been very attached to the news and what's happening there. And I can see that Russia uses the nuclear weapon threat a lot to scare out Western countries from supporting people in Ukraine. And I wonder, what do you think are the efficient strategies here to be able to support people in Ukraine, but also to avoid escalation?
Yeah, this has been one of the biggest uncertainties that has really dominated discussions about U.S. support to Ukraine. And I think early in the conflict, there was a huge concern that the Russians would use nuclear weapons if they perceived even a small disadvantage. I think that has eroded over time. And so you can see that the U.S. government has become more comfortable with providing longer range weapons, for example, because they are less concerned that the Russians are going to respond with a nuclear weapon. Now, that said, that seems to be changing, or at least the rhetoric is escalating out of Russia recently. And you can see that Putin is relying more and more on the threat of a nuclear response to try and deter both the U.S. and Western allies from supporting Ukraine. And I wish I could tell you that there's a great theory that could explain whether they're going to use nuclear weapons or not. I know there were a lot of war games that were happening, that are probably still happening, that are trying to understand these incentives. And this is probably not very helpful and not very comforting, but we truly don't know if there is a point at which Putin gets pushed where he feels like he is now in that situation where deliberate escalation to nuclear weapons is decidedly to his advantage. And that is, one of the most complicated set of decisions that a decision maker has to make. And I have no good answer for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer.
Yeah, sobering thoughts. We probably have time for two questions if we're quick here while the next panel is setting up. So I'll do one online. The question is, given rigid military cultures, assistive AI may have the effect of validating human user confirmation bias. Should the human user be obligated to provide AI a second iteration to question or comment on the human decision, in effect, a conversation on risk for sober second thought? So some sort of second round consideration around AI recommendations from AI systems.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I like the idea of trying to find some way of interfacing with the user that forces them to question their own biases and heuristics. And I think that the question bringing up organizational characteristics. So very rigid organizations may be less likely to question the technology. And it could be, I'm not a China expert, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn. I'm just kidding. But I have done some work on kind of Chinese decision making, and in some instances, they're more likely to trust machines and technology than they are humans. And they also have a very regimented set of kind of rules about how their soldiers, sailors, airmen interact with technology. So, for example, I'm part of a track 2 between US and China, and we ran a small little war game that actually had an AI gone wrong. It was a version of a game that actually Max presented some results on. And I remember one of our Chinese players said, this is crazy. You're telling us that we can come up with how we use the technology. That's kind of the first move of the game. And he's like, if the PLA gives me a technology, then I'm going to use the technology because the PLA gave it to me. Like it wasn't in his it wasn't in his nature to question whether the people who had made the decisions about buying that technology, developing that technology, and implementing, whether they could possibly be wrong. As a big difference when I run this game with Americans, American military officers are like, I don't know about that. Not sure I trust that system. I don't think that's been completely validated, right? Like it's just kind of culturally, there's more room for military officers to be cynical of the process by which they receive that technology than it was for, granted, the N of one, the PLA officer that I played the game with. So I think those organizational incentives are really important. And if you know that the organizational incentives are set up to create that kind of bias towards trusting the system, even when you shouldn't, then I think your recommendation that perhaps then you build into the technology some actual kind of check that forces the user to reevaluate, I think that's a great idea.
Cool. Yeah, very interesting. One last question.
Yeah, for the record, Jackie and I never talked about that deduction on trust before our presentation. But thanks, Jackie. I reinforced the findings from today. Hey, it's Paul. Really appreciated your presentation. As always, excellent work. I have 2 quick questions. The first is on the stability-instability paradox. So when we have nuclear mutual assured destruction at the strategic level, it potentially creates instability at lower levels of warfare. And I'm just kind of curious what your understanding of AI integrated to nuclear command and control means for the stability-instability paradox. Will it shift one way or the other? And the second quick question is just brief thoughts, if you will, on the implications of AI for the balance of power between countries, right? So you've talked about AI grafted onto nuclear command and control as sort of the key mechanism for stability globally. I wonder if you see AI is a thing unto itself, much like Horowitz and others have talked about being destabilizing, and if so, what are the sort of alternate worlds we can experience with AI and the balance of power? Thanks.
So I'm going to punt on your first question on stability and instability, and I'm going to take the second one. And so the second one, actually, this is really fascinating, right? So I've talked almost completely about nuclear stability here, but really, technologies, the way they influence overall balances of power is really the way in which they shift the international system. And so I think for AI, it's how AI enables states to kind of, increase their economic growth and build their economic power. But then in terms of military balances of power, how AI affects their ability to sustain conflict over time. So I think the US in the past has been interested in how technology creates overwhelming uses of force for very short periods of time. But instead, I think kind of like the long-term big shift in power is if AI creates an ability for states to withstand conflict for a long period of time and sustain conflict for a long period of time. So I think that would be how artificial intelligence both increases the economic power of a state and also how it decreases the cost of war. And the cost of war could be both political or economic, but I think that the real kind of revolutionary effect here is how it could create long-term economic ability to sustain conflict. And I think I actually think we're watching that evolve on the battlefield with Russia and Ukraine, especially with Ukraine, as Ukraine is increasingly relying on large data and data-enabled technologies and campaigns in order to survive for longer against a much bigger state.
Thanks, Jackie.
Cool. Thanks to everyone for asking great questions. Thanks to the audience for your attention. Thanks to Jackie most of all. That was a great talk. Very impressive going slideless. I love it. I, for one, appreciated the Dr. Strangelove reference. So glad it was there. Well, at least one of us has seen the movie. It's a great movie. Go watch it. Very relevant, shockingly, for a movie from 1960. All right, up next, we have a panel. Well, first, yes, round of applause.